Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, hi everyone, welcome to this week's ESRG seminar. Thanks for coming. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to ask questions in the chat and we'll try and answer them at the end if there's time. I'm going to hand over to Andy now, who is chairing this week's seminar, and he'll introduce the speaker for today.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. And yeah, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce Courtney Sprain from the University of Florida. So Courtney was an undergraduate at Minnesota, doing a bachelor's in geology and geophysics and graduating in 2012. And then she went on to do a PhD at Berkeley and kind of split her time between the famous Berkeley Geochronological Center and the Paleo Mag Lab. There, graduating in 2017, when we were lucky enough to have her join us here at Liverpool for 2 years. And not content with bringing her expertise in geochronology and paleomag, she also branched out into numerical dynamo simulation as well. And yeah, I think that's really what characterizes Courtney as one of the researchers with the broadest expertise of anyone that I know. And yeah, we were very sad when she left us in 2019. This was very cheerful and positive member of the group, very helpful as well. And but we were very happy for her as well because she got this position in Florida, which allowed her to pursue all of those interests. And I think it's on the geochron side that she's going to be talking today. So over to you, Courtney.
Great, yeah, thanks for the introduction, Andy and Caitlin, and also Janine, and yeah, thanks for the invitation. So as Andy said, I do a lot of different things, but today in this talk, I will be focusing on the topic of mass extinction events. So mass extinction events, this is kind of a really important outstanding question in the field of earth science, and that is what causes these large-scale global ecosystem collapse events. And this is important not only for understanding these events in Earth's past, you know, where we had lots of life going extinct very suddenly, which basically shaped evolution going through Earth history. But it's additionally important for today because in our future, we're in many ways facing very similar events and could be staring down the barrel of large-scale global ecosystem collapse. So understanding how this happened in the past may help us mitigate it in the future. And so just want to do a quick shout out for some of the acknowledgements. Liverpool's not on here, but it should be. Just a lot of this work was originally done at the Berkeley Geochronology Center, and Berkeley is continued at UF with all of these different funding agencies. And there are lots of different collaborators on this project. So this is by no means a single person effort. And so jumping back into my talk, the question of what causes large-scale ecosystem collapse, as I already mentioned, is especially pertinent in the modern world as we're facing things like anthropogenic climate change, sea level rise. This is the state of Florida. This has predicted what it might look like, you know, after the ice caps melt, which is not great. Fortunately, I live in the center of the state around here, so should be okay. No beachfront property, unfortunately. And in addition to this, we also have large-scale deforestation, and then also pollution, and among other things that are threatening global ecosystem collapse. And so, you know, fortunately, we don't have to answer the question of what causes global ecosystem collapse ourselves in order to understand what can cause it. So throughout Earth's history, there have been 5 major mass extinction events where between 50 to 96% of species went extinct suddenly. And so those are marked on this plot here. This is the familial marine biodiversity curve. And so these sharp drops here where we're seeing this drop in diversity and then the number of families, these are indicating our mass extinction events. And so in general, mass extinction events have many things in common. So one is, for the most part, most of them occur on short timescales of around 1 million years or less. You can see that here as these are kind of these nice little spikes where we're seeing these increases in extinction rate. This is what's marking these extinction events. Additionally, they tend to be associated with major shifts in climate. And so this can include both global cooling, but also global warming. And then we also tend to see major perturbations in the carbon cycle as well that are associated with these events. And then additionally, we have 4 out of 5 of these main events that, coinciding with the eruption of large igneous provinces. And so that's shown on this plot here, where on the y-axis, we have the age of extinction events, so the timing of these extinction events, correlated with the timing of these large igneous provinces. And we can see that for 4 of the mass extinction events, they tend to fall on this 1-to-1 line, indicating that there's this general correlation. However, Earth's system is really complicated. We know this as Earth scientists. And so these broad generalizations that people have made about what causes mass extinction events and simply correlating them to like, oh, well, we saw global warming, that must have been it. Or, oh, it coincided with the eruption of a large igneous province. It must have been the large igneous province that caused it, is not really going to give us insight into what mechanistically is happening during these events and what are actually the steps that lead to large-scale global ecosystem collapse. And so to properly understand this and to understand mass extinction events, we need to step back from these broad generalizations about mass extinction events and start looking at these events in more detail. And so this kind of comes to the question, well, how do we determine the cause of mass extinction events? So in order to determine the cause of mass extinction events, we need to be able to tie our potential forcing mechanisms like large-scale meteor impacts or large-scale volcanism to observed environmental change. This can be things like global warming, global cooling, sea level rise, sea level fall, ocean acidification, and then finally to ecological change and to extinction. So we need to be able to directly correlate these forcing mechanisms to how they're perturbing the environment. And then we need to be able to show that these perturbations to the environment were enough and extreme enough to cause global ecosystem collapse. And so on a first order, what we need to be able to do is to prove that these different events are closely associated in time. And then second, we need to be able to show that that the scale of these events, the scale of the environmental change, the scale of the proposed perturbation coming from our forcing mechanism would be enough to cause the observed ecological change and major extinction event. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on some of my research on one of my favorite, actually, mass extinction event, which is the mass extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous. And the cause of which at first, many of you might think, oh, well, isn't this solved already? But I'm hoping to show you by the end of this talk that once we zoom into this event, it may not be as clearly solved as we once believed, and that there's more to meet the eye. So jumping into a little bit of background about this event, what do we know? Well, we know it occurred 66 million years ago. And so this is actually our most recent mass extinction event to today, which is really important because it means we have really excellent preservation of sites that preserve the mass extinction event all around the world. We have truly global coverage. We see the KPG boundary on just about every continent. We have marine records, terrestrial records. And so it's really one of the best preserved events that we can use to study what causes mass extinctions. This event killed 50% of the species living on Earth at the time, or over 50% of the species. It ultimately led the rise for mammals and the evolution of our own species. So it's a pretty important event in our own history. And then finally, the reason why most of you might be familiar with this event, even if, or some of you or family might be familiar with this event, even if they're not Earth scientists, is it killed all of the non-avian dinosaurs. So pretty important in that regard. And so what caused this event? This is one of the outstanding questions we're looking at here. And so it's generally agreed upon that the majority of these extinctions associated with the end Cretaceous event were coincident with the arrival of a large meteor impact. And so this impactor was proposed to be about 10 kilometers wide. It hit in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is in the Caribbean, just off the coast of Mexico, and created the Chicxulub crater, which is 100 kilometers wide. And we have evidence for this event not only in the crater, which has been dated in time to be coincident with the mass extinction event. But additionally, we have evidence of the meteor impact at Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary sites around the world, including iridium anomalies, shock quartz, melt droplets, which are all indicative of this extraterrestrial, impactor hitting Earth. And so there's significant evidence for this event. And it also generally corresponds with many of the extinctions that we're looking at, particularly in the marine realm, tend to be very abrupt. And so within, a couple centimeters of sediment, you will see, a thriving group of forams and other things living. They're pretty diverse. And then within a couple of centimeters, at a coincident with where we're seeing this impact layer that has the iridium in it, all of a sudden, 50% of them go extinct. And so in the marine record, abrupt extinction, which would be correlated really nicely with this idea that this impactor caused the mass extinction event. But kind of this elephant in the room that's kind of stood in the background of most Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary mass extinction discussions has been the Deccan Traps. So in addition to this large meteor impactor, during the end Cretaceous and the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction, we also had the eruption of the Deccan Traps. And so to give you a bit of an idea of what the Deccan Traps are, here is a photo that I took in India of the Deccan Traps. And so the Deccan Traps are a large igneous province, or also known as a continental flood basalt sequence. It's currently exposed over about a third of India. And so this is like, I think the area of like 3 Great Britons. That might be, or a third of Great Britain. I can't remember. It's the size of Texas for anyone who's familiar with American aerial extents. But so it's pretty big aerial extent. It's about 4 kilometers thick at its maximum thickness if you piled all of the lava together on top of one another. It covers over 1 million cubic kilometers of lava being erupted, or that had been erupted. And so just to give you an idea of scale, each of these stripes is an individual lava flow. And these are about 30 meters thick to upwards of 100 meters thick in this section. And all these light layers in here are actually, they're not different layers. It's just the vesicular flow tops is where a lot of grasses and stuff like growing, because there's space for them to grow. But this is indeed all lava. And then this whole sequence here is only the upper third of the Deccan Traps. And so this is a really big volcanic event. And so the reason why people have attributed part of the mass extinction to the Deccan Traps is because, as we saw earlier, it was erupting around the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, we have this general coincidence between other mass extinction events and the eruption of large igneous provinces. And additionally, we also have some evidence in the late Cretaceous of climate change, including a warming event and a cooling event, that seems to be associated with where we're also seeing evidence of ecological stress in terrestrial ecosystems that may be indicating that the Deccan Traps could have played a role in the mass extinction. However, until recently, and until some of our work, there wasn't really enough high precision geochronology to attest whether or not these things were closely associated in time. And there wasn't enough studies on looking at the potential environmental impact of Deccan to understand whether or not this even could have caused the climate change that's being observed in the late Cretaceous. And so that's kind of been the objective of most of my work, is to try to better understand the role of the Deccan Traps in the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. And so, like I said earlier, how do we determine the cause? It's going to be looking at both the timing of these events to see if the Deccan Traps correlated with where we're seeing these records of terrestrial ecological stress, and also with records of climate change. But then also looking at the response. So trying to test whether or not the Deccan Traps could have feasibly erupted on a timescale, produced enough CO2 or sulfur to have resulted in the observed environmental signal. And then was that environmental signal also strong enough to have caused any major changes to the environment and to the animals and plants living at that time? And so the first part of this work I'm going to jump through is how do we test that these are closely associated in time? And so to do this, we sought, my colleagues and I, to create a high resolution, high precision chronologic framework that tied together the timing of terrestrial ecological change. And so this is marked here. This is actually a photo of a mammal tooth. Oh, the scale's not on here, but mammal teeth are really small, so this is really small. To records of climate change, and then finally to our records of Deccan Traps volcanism. So trying to attest, are these records of ecological change closely associated in time with where we're seeing changes in climate? And then are these together closely associated with where we're seeing the Deccan Traps erupt? And so to do this work and to build this framework, we relied on two tools. So one is argon-argon geochronology, and then the other is magnetostratigraphy. And so a little bit of background on both of these techniques. Argon-argon geochronology is a variant of the potassium-argon dating method, whereby potassium-40 through electron capture decays to argon-40. And this process has a half-life of about 1.25 billion years, making it a really useful technique for dating effectively all of Earth history. And so the reason we specifically chose this technique for studying the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is materials amenable to argon-argon geochronology are found in volcanic ashes within terrestrial sections. So we can use them to determine the timing of terrestrial ecological change. We can also use argon-argon geochronology to directly date tektites. These are little melt droplets directly from the Chicxulub crater, directly from the meteor crater. So we can actually date the Chicxulub impact using this technique. And then also we can use argon-argon geochronology to directly date the lava flows in the Deccan Traps as well. It also has high precision, so it has an achievable precision level of 0.1% or better. We also don't have to worry about magma residence effects. This is something that can affect the uranium lead system. So because argon-40 is a noble gas, it easily diffuses out of systems. So you don't have to really worry about it accumulating in any grains that grew in a magma chamber before eruption. And so ultimately we chose this because it is the most direct way to date all of the things that we wanted to look at for the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary extinction event. And then additionally, we were looking at magnetostratigraphy. And so magnetostratigraphy is useful for dating things around the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction. And it is commonly used as a means for age control in sections where there isn't material for direct dating. So there isn't ash material. So it's commonly used in terrestrial sections, also in marine sections like IODB cores. And it's also been used in the Deccan Traps. And so it's useful because these reversal boundaries can kind of be thought of as globally synchronous points in time. We know they do occur over periods of roughly 10,000 years or less, but we can kind of effectively point to a boundary of a reversal and be like, yes, this is the same thing that we're seeing over here. So it's a good correlation tool. And then the reason this is important or useful for the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is we have reversals happening about a few 100,000 years, or a reversal happening a few 100,000 years before the mass extinction, and then a few 100,000 years after. So the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary marked here by this red line falls in the middle of Cron C29R. And so we have these two useful bracketing points that makes magnetostratigraphy a really effective tool in understanding the timing of these changes around the mass extinction event. And then also the reason we use these tools was because it was the most direct way to correlate our results to other results around the world. So there are 350 Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary sites around the world. And these are in both marine and terrestrial realms. And so most of our terrestrial sections we can date with argon-argon, uranium-lead, or magstrat. Chicxulub is argon-argon. Marine sections are dominantly dated by astrochronology or magnetostratigraphy. And in Deccan, we can date it with argon-argon, uranium-lead, and magnetostratigraphy. But I'm hoping you can see here where I've kind of highlighted the ones we're using, is it really is the most direct way to try to correlate, our results that we might be obtaining in the terrestrial realm or in Deccan to other localities, both in marine or in the terrestrial realm around the world. And so this is why we chose these techniques. And so now jumping into our work, jumping into some of our terrestrial work. So why did we choose the terrestrial realm? So the reason we chose the terrestrial realm is because the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary mass extinction event had a really large ecological impact on the terrestrial realm, which ended basically, the age of the dinosaurs, which had dominated most of the Mesozoic, and spawned, the rise and the age of mammals, which is what we're currently living in. And the reason we also chose the terrestrial realm is because it's one of the only places where we do see signs of ecological stress in the late Cretaceous. And so it's possible that the terrestrial realm was more susceptible to changes from Deccan Traps and to gases released from Deccan Traps than the marine realm. So it might be one of our only places to find potential records of what the Deccan Traps may have been doing to late Cretaceous environments. But despite all of this, very few studies have quantified high resolution temporal patterns of both change before the extinction event and then also after, and in periods of recovery. And so we sought to improve this in our work. And so for this work, we went to the Hell Creek region in northeastern Montana, which is marked here. Just for a frame of reference, this boundary here this is the United States, this is Canada, this state here is Montana, and this box here is our study area. And so the Hell Creek region is around the Fort Peck Reservoir, which is this lake shown here. And the reason we chose this locality is because the Hell Creek is arguably one of the best terrestrial sites of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary around the world. We have a really well-defined Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary based on not only fossil evidence, but also based on we have an iridium anomaly and an impact layer preserved here. We also have a really excellent fossil record. There have been over 500 localities for paleontology recorded in this region, including both dinosaur sites, but also microfauna like mammal teeth. And there have been over 150,000 vertebrate microfossils collected in the Hell Creek. So it's a really great area to study this terrestrial ecological change. We also have numerous volcanic ashes, and these ashes have material in them that's amenable to argon-argon geochronology. And then also it's been shown that the sediments here are good paleomagnetic recorders. So this is really the perfect site for our work. And so what we did is we sought to create a chronostratigraphic framework using both our argon-argon geochronologic technique and also paleomagnetism. And so for this, we collected 33 ashes and 285 paleomagnetic samples across the region. And so all of the black dots are where we collected for just geochronology, and all of the orange ones are where we collected magnetostratigraphic sections and also samples for geochronology. And so the reason we had to collect so many samples is because these are fluvial sediments, and this area is really a badlands type region. And so it's really difficult to correlate across the region based on lithology or stratigraphy alone. Looking at these two photos, it's really hard to tell, okay, is this one older than this one or younger than this one? Is this the same section? Is it not? And so we basically, wherever we had a good fossil site, had to go in and directly date something within that sequence in order to correlate it to other sites across the region. And so jumping into the results, here's an example of some of our argon-argon analyses. And so this is a rank order age distribution plot where on the y-axis is age, the x-axis is rank order. Each of these individual dots is a single crystal total fusion experiment on a single grain of sanidine. So the black dot is the mean age, and then the bar is the 1 sigma uncertainty on that. And so for each tephra, each ash that we collected, we ran between 30 to 100 individual grains of sanidine. As you can see for this particular sample, we ran about 56. And so what I want you to take away from looking at these plots is two things. So one, we're seeing kind of a nice Gaussian distribution from our data. So we're not really seeing complexities with xenocrysts, which are materials that are older than what we expect our sample to be. We're getting really nice, really clear and obvious age signals from these. Also, we're able to achieve high precision on these samples with uncertainties on the order of 30,000 years for samples that are 66 million years old. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that these two samples are from two different sites, but of a collection of the same ash layer. And so they should be giving the same age. and they do with an uncertainty. So that's another check that we're getting good geochronology from these sites. And so just because that particular ash happened to be, so this is our impact layer. This is within a coal seam. This impact layer has the iridium anomaly melt droplets is effectively the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. And then we have this ash layer that I just showed you results for about a centimeter above it. And so besides the samples that I just showed you, we ran about 600 more analyses from this in order to create a new age for the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, which is shown here with this really, really nice 8,000 year precision, which is pretty spectacular. And so now jumping into some of our magnetostratigraphy results, I'm going to show you what we have from our eastern area. And so these plots are showing these are stratigraphic columns, so it's stratigraphic height, and then this is VGP latitude, which effectively all you need to know is where we're going from negative to positive numbers, and this is indicating a magnetic reversal. And so what we can see from these 4 sites is we've identified the reversal at these 4 localities. Our resolution here within our magnetic data is on the order of 1 meter. And so this allows basically the correlation of some of these sites together at a much higher resolution than we're able to achieve with high precision geochronology alone. So this is a really useful technique also for correlating our sections across the region. And so now jumping back into the big picture, what were we able to observe by tying all of our geochronologic, paleontologic, and also magnetostratigraphic data together? We were able to show that mammalian faunal decline started beginning about 400 to 150,000 years before the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. Additionally, we were able to constrain an early mammal recovery phase to within 328,000 years of the Paleogene. We also observed a late recovery phase that's constrained to between 328 and 850,000 years after the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. And then finally, mammals in this region were not able to recover fully until about 1 million years after the mass extinction event, which is a pretty long recovery period. And so now that we've been able to determine kind of the rates and timings of terrestrial ecological decline and recovery following the mass extinction event, we want to be able to correlate it to records of climate change and records of environmental change to assess whether or not these environmental stressors could have been causing what we're observing in terrestrial species. And so for this, I'm going to focus on the next part of my work, which is the calibration in the geomagnetic polarity timescale. And so what I mean by calibration in the geomagnetic polarity timescale is effectively that we're going to be obtaining high precision ages for the 2 reversals that bracket the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. And so by doing this, it will allow us to basically export all of the results that we were able to determine in our terrestrial sections to other Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary sites around the world that had magnetostratigraphy, including marine sections, which is where we have most of our records of climate change. And so for this work, we utilize the same magnetostratigraphic sections that we had previously collected. And then we also utilize the same chronologic data. And so what we did is in sections where we had a dated horizon below our determined magnetic reversal and a dated horizon above our determined magnetic reversal, we used linear interpolation between the 2 to calculate our desired reversal ages. And so we were able to do this for the C29R, C29N reversal at 6 sections and the C30N, C29R reversal in 2 sections. And so by doing this, we were able to determine new ages for these reversal boundaries. And we can see here, these are our results here. They generally correlate with previous results. This was using uranium lead, and then also with what's presented in the geologic timescale. But now these are directly correlated to our results in the terrestrial realm that we previously determined. And so it's a much easier and more kind of exact way and higher precision way of directly correlating what we found in the terrestrial realm to climate signals that might be in other records, but we can now add absolute dates to those records using these new reversal ages. And so using this calibration, we can now estimate the timing of climate change and then also see how what was going on in the marine realm correlates to what we're observing in the terrestrial sections. And so using our new data, we were able to determine that warming ended. So, and this is a record just for clarification. So this particular record is showing a Delta 018 record. Where moving to the right is showing warming and to the left is cooling. And so we have this nice kind of warming and cooling event right before the mass extinction event. These two intervals are showing records of recovery. So we have our full mammalian recovery record of about 1 million years. And early recovery in the ocean record is about the same time scale. And then this is a record, this mammal evenness is basically a proxy for ecological stress, where lower numbers and decreasing numbers, what you need to know is it's indicating increasing ecological stress. And so with our new data, we're able to determine that warming ended about 150,000 years before the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, and cooling within the last 259,000 years. We were able to see that there's kind of an onset of climate change roughly coincides with where we're seeing this onset of terrestrial ecological stress in roughly the last 150 to 400,000 years before the extinction event. And then we're also able to observe that this long recovery period that we're observing in mammals in the terrestrial realm is also something that's observed in marine fauna. And so early ocean recovery also took about 1 million years. And so this is a relatively long recovery interval after a mass extinction event. And so the next important question is, how does all of this correlate with Deccan volcanism? And so that is the last part of this part of my talk. So let's move on to the Deccan Traps. So the Deccan Traps, as I already showed, are exposed in India. All of this orange here is where they're currently exposed. For our work, we worked in the Western Ghats, which is this box region here, where all of these little red lines are showing the traverses that we sampled along, and all of the orange dots is where we collected samples. And so the reason why we chose the Western Ghats, which is this region here, is because in the Western Ghats, we have great access to some of the best exposed continuous sections of Deccan lava. And so here's an example of 2 photos I took in the Western Ghats. This is an aerial view over the part of the Western Ghats. And so as you can see, all of these outcrops are lava. So this is really good exposure of Deccan lava. And then also you can see here in the photo I previously showed, really nice stratigraphy. And so we can basically sample most of these flows by just driving up a road along the Ghats. So it's really great exposure of these sections. And then also the Western Ghats preserves the largest volume of Deccan lava. And so it is the most likely source of gases that could have led to the climate change. So if we're thinking that the Deccan Traps played a role, we most likely would see it coinciding with the eruption of this large volume of Deccan lava. And so for this work, we went to the Deccan Traps. We collected about 100 samples. This is my PhD advisor, Paul Rennie. This is Mark Richards, who is one of our collaborators. We did this across 8 sections, and we sampled all chemical formations. But in order to obtain really high precision geochronology that's not biased by things like alteration, we wanted to make sure that the material that we were dating, in this case, which is plagioclase, was not biased by basically, being in a tropical environment for the last 66 million years. So plagioclase and other feldspars can easily alter to clays at Earth's surface, and so clay has potassium in it, and so can effectively restart our argon-argon clock. And so what we were looking for in our samples is ones that did not show signs of significant alteration. And so to test for this, we just took a bunch of thin sections, which I'm showing here. This is cross-polarized light and plane polarized light. And so we were looking in particular for samples where the plagioclase, which are these laths here, didn't have signs of clay alteration within them and looked relatively fresh and pristine. And so these were 2 examples of 2 of the samples that we did pick for dating. So after doing this analysis, our 100 samples came down to 36. And so before showing you the new results, I want to show you an example of what the geochronology looked like in the Deccan before our work. So this is all of the old argon-argon geochronology that was done in the Deccan Traps, recalibrated to the same standard age. So they're all comparable. And as you can see, there's a wide span in ages from basically before 60 or before 70 million years to 62 million years. So spanning about 10 million years of Earth history. You can see on each of these individual points, this is the age and their uncertainty. Some of these uncertainties are huge, on the order of millions of years. And we're also observing, so this is our stratigraphic superposition and stratigraphic height going up in the Y column. And these do not preserve stratigraphic superposition, so are effectively not useful for trying to correlate Deccan to other signals around the mass extinction event. And so now jumping into our new work, first I just want to note there's going to be a change in scale, which is a good thing. So here's our new work. And so this again is still showing this is stratigraphic height versus age. So this plot here is showing our results from that were published in Rennie et al. 2015. And then this is showing our new results that were published in 2019, where all of our blue dots are the new ones over the ones that were presented before. And so hopefully you can observe a few things that are different from the previous plot I showed you. So one is we were able to vastly improve the precision of our samples. So we're now getting uncertainties on the order of hundreds of thousands of years instead of millions of years. And additionally, we're now able to observe stratigraphic superposition, which is what we expect these samples to follow. So it's good. So we've greatly improved the geochronology. But the important question in understanding, what did Deccan do in the mass extinction event is we need to know where the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is in the Deccan Traps. We need to know how much of it was erupting before the extinction event and whether or not, that amount could have released enough gas to cause environmental change. And so the tricky thing with the Deccan is even though we have vastly improved precision, we still have multiple of our dates overlapping with the age of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, which is shown here. So all of these points and their uncertainty bounds where they overlap with this bar is indicating that they're overlapping with our age for the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. And so unlike our terrestrial sections, we can't point at a boundary in the Deccan of where the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is because there's no sediment preserved. So we don't have the iridium anomaly. We don't have fossils. And so we have to do it based on geochronology alone. And so to improve our estimate of where the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary was, we decided to use a Bayesian age model to determine the most likely position of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary in our section based on our data. And so we used the model Bacon, if you're familiar with it. And using this, we were able to determine that the most likely position for the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is close to the bushy polar pore contact. You don't really need to know where that is, other than it's about 2/3 of the way into the Deccan stratigraphy. And this location, for those of you who are familiar with the impact triggering hypothesis, is consistent with where Richards et al. Proposed that this boundary might be. And so with our new position of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary plotted here, this is now, instead of plotting versus stratigraphic height, this is plotted versus cumulative minimum volume. So basically we rescaled it because these top 3 formations in the Deccan Traps are the most voluminous. They represent over 75% of the volume of Deccan lava. And so we wanted to highlight, that these are significantly more important than the ones down here in terms of volume. And so this is now versus cumulative minimum volume. And so with our new Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary location, what do we observe in the Deccan? Well, we see that 90% of the Deccan volume in the Western Ghats was erupted relatively quickly within about 1 million years. But we also see with our location of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary that 75% of this volume erupted after the mass extinction event, which will become significant shortly. And so in regards to dating the Deccan Traps, we were not the only ones working on it. And so at the same time, there's this group led by Blair Shaney at Princeton that was seeking to do uranium lead analyses on zircons separated from red bulls, which are these horizons here, which are weathering horizons. They might be sediment, but the idea is there might have been some ash material that was preserved within them. And so Blair Shaney and his group dated zircons separated from these red bulls. And so comparing our 2 results, where the red here is showing the uranium lead results, blue is our argon results. For the most part, our ages generally agree. There's some discrepancies here in some of the younger parts of the formation, but overall it's pretty good agreement. We do have slightly different locations for the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, where our most likely position was down here at the base of the polar pore, and theirs was at the top. However, I'm plotting both of the proposed ages here to kind of show you they still really agree here. It's just, it looks like the polypore formation erupted relatively quickly. And so although if you've heard any of the media about this saying we got different positions, it's terrible, they're actually significantly more similar than they appear. But it's important to note that even using the uranium lead location for the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary within the stratigraphy, it's still showing that 50% of the volume erupted after the mass extinction event. And so in addition to dating stuff in the Western Ghats, we also went to this remote area in Rajamundry where we have only a couple of lava flows preserved. But the reason we went here is because the Rajamundry traps, which is effectively these 3 lava flows, have been correlated to the Deccan. And so if they were correlated to the Deccan Traps, would indicate that these are some of the longest lava flows on Earth, and also that there was a major pulse of volcanism whenever these flows reached Rajamundry. And so we went there, we dated them, we did show that they're most likely associated, their chemical affinities and their ages match nicely with what we see in the Western Ghats. So they're most likely part of the Deccan, and they are indicating a major phase of volcanism occurred after the mass extinction event. And so now let's tie all of this together. Our terrestrial results, our climate records, and then also Deccan Traps. What do we see? So first we see that this long recovery interval is roughly coincident with where we're seeing the Deccan Traps continuing after the mass extinction event and coincides with this major pulse of volcanism, suggesting that Deccan may have played a role in inhibiting recovery from the extinction event. We also see that the onset of the Deccan Traps roughly coincides with where we're seeing terrestrial ecological decline and this warming and cooling event. However, we know looking at our volume estimates that this is only coinciding with the eruption of 25 to 50% of the lava in the Western Ghats. And 50 to 75% of it was erupted after the mass extinction event. And during this interval, we're not seeing significant climate change. And so this is really confusing. So the initial assumption was that lava volume is directly correlatable to gas release. So wherever you're seeing the largest volume of lava being erupted should be where you're seeing the largest climatic signal. And we're not seeing that. So it's either indicating that our previous assumptions about how gas is released in these systems is incorrect, and we need to go back and look at it in more detail, or Deccan wasn't causing this climate signal and didn't really play a role in the extinction event. And so right now our climate response, yeah, as I said, not what we expected. And so the role of the Deccan is still kind of unclear. And so this leads me to the next part of how do we determine the cause of mass extinction events, and that is understanding Earth system response to these things. So we've shown that Deccan correlates nicely in time with, where we're seeing climatic changes and where we're seeing signs of ecological stress. But our results here are basically telling us, well, we now really need to critically assess response. We need to assess whether or not the lava that was erupted before the mass extinction event, had enough gas that could have perturbed the environment in the way that we observe. And we also need to show that that perturbation could have caused this ecological stress that we're observing in the terrestrial realm. And so this is the focus of my future work and ongoing work. And so this is broadly divided into 2 separate projects. And so one is looking to constrain the tempo of eruptions. Tempo is important. I'll get to this in a second. And then also constraining the Earth system response to the release of volcanic gases in the amounts that we expect to be erupted of the Deccan Traps, and seeing whether or not the gas that we expect to come out of Deccan and the timing of it, could have feasibly caused our observed environmental changes. And so just a little bit of background on this first project. So large igneous provinces affect the environment through a variety of processes. And so this can be through the eruption of sulfates, which turn into aerosols, which can cause cooling, can cause acidification. The eruption of a lot of basalt to Earth's surface can lead to a weathering response and can actually help draw down CO2. We also have global warming associated with the eruption of CO2. And so there's really this broad range of timescales over which there are responses to large igneous province eruptions. And so that's what this plot is showing here, different timescales of different climatic and biosphere responses. And so we see that large igneous provinces can kind of force environments on a really broad time scale, but these responses can be relatively short. And so kind of on the order of, tens of years to hundreds of years to thousands of years. And so to understand whether or not Deccan eruptions really played a role in kind of, perturbing environments, whether or not some of these short scale things could have, built up upon one another. We need to understand the timing of individual eruptions. So we need to know, were the Deccan lavas erupting frequently enough where gases that have a short-lived residence time in the atmosphere, such as sulfur, could they have built up enough in the environment to actually cause global change? And so to assess this, we need to look at the timing of individual eruptions. But unfortunately, individual eruptions occur on a timescale that is beyond the resolution achievable by absolute geochronology alone. And so we need a different method to assess the timescale of individual eruptions. And so two of the proposed mechanisms that in a recently funded NSF project that I'm working on that we propose to do to get at these timescales is through a combination of cosmogenic helium-3 work and then also magnetic secular variation. And so as I just said, this is a new project that was recently funded by NSF. It's in collaboration with Marissa Tremblay at Purdue, where she is working on cosmogenic work, trying to assess how much cosmogenic helium-3 may have accumulated into the top of lava flows before another lava flow came on top of it and basically closed off production rate. And then we'll be combining this with paleosecular variation, where basically we're using short-term variations in Earth's magnetic field to generate kind of a relative eruptive sequence in a stratigraphic section of Deccan lavas. And unfortunately, we were supposed to go to India this December. Obviously, due to the pandemic, we did not do that. We're hoping to go this coming December, but we may not be able to do that then either. So stay tuned, we will be getting samples as soon as we can. But yeah, stay tuned for future work on this project. And then the other part of my work looking at response is trying to constrain what the Earth system response to the coupled release of both carbon and sulfur would be from Deccan lavas. And so the project is basically trying to combine the role of sulfur and carbon in long duration Earth system models. And so we're running LOSCAR, which is a long-term ocean atmosphere sediment carbon cycle reservoir model, basically to try to understand what changes we might observe in the ocean, in temperature, in the atmosphere and in the ocean, in acidification and other things like that, by not only the release of CO2, which is commonly what LOSCAR is used for, but also coupled with the release of sulfur, as we know that both of these gases were released with the eruption of the Deccan and with other large igneous provinces. And so this is in collaboration with Tushar Mittal and Isabel Fenley, and one of my students is currently working on it. We have some preliminary results so far, where here I'm showing results from our carbon-only model, and here is our combined carbon and sulfur model where we added sulfur back in. And so we are observing some unexpected results. We're seeing that sulfur does seem to have an effect on the carbon cycle on long time scales. One obvious result shown here is all of these little blips down here in temperature are showing you when sulfur was released. It's showing you these short-term cooling intervals that can happen with sulfur. But we're also observing changes in pH. We're actually getting observable differences in pH between our carbon and sulfur models and our carbon-only models. So basically, we're seeing, by adding sulfur to our understanding of these systems, we are seeing that it has an effect on what we expect the carbon cycle to do on long time scales. And so this is a focus of future work. We're still working on it, hoping to add more realistic estimates for what we expect for Deccan, and then also trying to understand, the amount of gas that we might need to actually have caused the climate signal that we're observing in the late Cretaceous, and whether or not that is even feasible for the Deccan Traps. And so in conclusion, the role of the Deccan in the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary event is still unclear, but there's a lot more work to come, so stay tuned. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Terrific talk. Please join me in virtual round of applause if you're able to find the reaction button. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Very, very exciting, very wide ranging, and I learned a lot. So I have some questions, but I'll give someone else an opportunity first. So just, yeah, you can hold your hand up or just start talking. Okay.
Hi, Andy, can you hear me? It's Chris Stevenson.
Yes, hi, Chris.
Hi, Courtney. Great talk, really enjoyed that. I'm wondering, have you thought about whether the meteorite impact and the large igneous province interact in some way? Because this has been the case for quite some time now. You have meteorite people, like Walter, and you have LIPS people, and for some reason they're mutually exclusive kill mechanisms.
Yeah.
So I think your talk nicely showed there's some complexity, but do they have to be mutually exclusive?
No, absolutely not. So there's kind of, I'll answer your question in two ways. So first, we do know that Chicxulub was causing probably the majority of extinctions. And so a big question with our work is whether or not Deccan was potentially weakening environments in the late Cretaceous to make species more susceptible to potentially going extinct from the extinction event. And then also trying to understand its role in recovery, because we have mammals quickly diversifying in the early Paleogene. And so it's really important to understand, kind of what was the environment under which they were diversifying. And then also recovery from these large things is, pretty important for understanding our own future as well. So I absolutely think they're both kind of connected in terms of what's causing the extinction event. But then the other part of my answer is related to actually what I had briefly mentioned, which was a study by Richards et al. In 2015, which I was actually on. And Mark Richards hypothesized that the Chicxulub impact could have enhanced volcanism in the Deccan Traps, because we do see this large pulse and increase in magmatism immediately after the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary in the Deccan Traps. We also have a change in chemistry, a change in dike orientation, a change in lava flow morphology, suggesting there was a fundamental shift in the magmatic system. And so Mark basically, was like, well, what if, the earthquake associated with the Chicxulub impact could have modified the magmatic environment in a way that could have changed the structure of, Deccan Traps eruptions thereafter. And so some of our dating was kind of trying to test that, seeing whether or not our identification with the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary matched with where we're seeing these changes in morphology. And right now it does. So we can't, disprove that hypothesis with geochronology, but there's a lot of more work on modeling and trying to actually, mechanistically understand how earthquakes might perturb volcanic systems, and if they do, and whether it scales beyond, just seeing some, mud volcanoes erupting today, to whether, it could cause a large igneous province to erupt. And so there's a lot more work on that front, but it's still something that is still being looked into.
Yeah, it sounds like a storyline from Superman or something like that at the moment. So
someone's meteor cause volcanoes to erupt. Yeah,
that's right. Well, thanks for calling. It's really nice.
Thanks,
you.
Chris, and thanks, Courtney. Any more questions from anyone else? No? Okay, I'll jump in with the question I have then. So great to see that you're planning on using secular variation to go further, higher resolution than has been possible before. Didn't Vincent Cortillo tried this trick, right? Was that in the Deccan Traps as well?
Yeah, so there's 3 papers that were closely published together by Chenet et al. Cortillo was a co-author, and they did a secular variation analysis of the Deccan. I have some minor issues with how they were defining directional groups, but also in order to directly couple it with the cosmogenic work we need to be sampling in exactly the same location. So we need to know that the lava flows where we see, this magnetic direction is corresponding with where we're seeing, this amount of helium-3. So basically, we need to connect the two systems, and we can't using the what was presented in the Chenet et al. Papers, because they didn't give a flow-by-flow kind of, here's what our structure looks like in the Deccan. And so it's not easy to go back to their sections and be like, this is where this sample is coming from. And then the additional thing we're trying to do on top of what they've done is, in collaboration with Tishar et al., we've been working on trying to create a more quantitative framework for estimating secular variation by running it through kind of this Bayesian inversion framework, predicting eruptions, using secular variation models to see what, directional groups would look like if you had an eruption tempo that looked like this, and what if you changed it, then what would it look like, and then kind of comparing our real data to these synthetic frameworks. And so we've started doing that, but we'd like to do it more where we have, we know the stratigraphy because we've been able to measure it. So it's really important in this, making sure we're not missing a lava flow. And then also we're hoping to add some things to it, like chemistry and other things that might be showing that there was a change in magmatic source, which could be indicating time between eruptions, basically. So it has been done. We're just trying to improve it.
Yeah, sure. Nice. It sounds good. So what secular variation model are you using? I mean,
yeah, so this has been a big uncertainty. So we started just repeating Cal's 10K, which is ridiculous because it's 10,000 years and this is, a million years of eruption. And then to kind of try to look at longer changes, we've been looking at ODP cores as kind of a reference of what long-term secular variation could look like. Obviously, those are probably more muted. We don't have them for the Cretaceous, but it's still better than not having an estimate of potential duration, and reversal rate around this time was similar to today. I mean, Cron C29R was like 700,000 years, which is reasonably similar to our current Cron. And so hopefully recent secular variation and like some of our 2 million-year-old IODP cores might be slightly representative of what we could expect for the Cretaceous. So we're starting with that, but there's room for improvement as soon as better records become available.
Sure. Great, thanks. Any final questions from Courtney? We're up to the hour now, so okay, I don't see any hands up, so I think we'll draw things to a close. But yeah, Caitlin posted the
Andy, there was one question in the chat, sorry.
Chat. Yeah, okay. So is there any way to distinguish between how much of the extinction was caused by lip and how much asteroid? Would different traits in the serving organisms be expected? Surviving, I guess that's supposed to.
Potentially. So that's one of the things that we're also hoping to constrain with understanding more of the Earth system response. So there are proposed environmental consequences of Chicxulub, global darkness, global cooling because of the ash being released, acid rain, global wildfires that may have effective things differently than the Deccan. But some of those are still relatively speculative. There's been a lot more coming out of the Chicxulub stuff with the core that they drilled through the crater. They're learning a lot more about, well, how much sulfur might have been there, how much cooling could we have expected, and so that's getting better. And we're hoping to improve some of that with the Deccan as well. And so hopefully once we can get a better idea of our system response, we can better predict, okay, well, these are the types of species that may have been more susceptible to this versus this. And then at the same time, there's a huge push in the paleontological community to look at food webs. And so trying to better understand, like, okay, well, if you remove, this species, does everything collapse? And so by combining some of that work with some of the work on our system responses, hopefully we'll get to a more cohesive answer of like, okay, this group of things most likely went extinct from this environmental forcing, which most likely came from, Deccan or Chicxulub. So we're working on it.
Sounds like there's still a lot more to do.
There's a lot more to do.
Okay, I'm going to draw things to a close there, but yeah, just to